Hey guys, Mulligan here, and a few weeks back I did some preview videos on some of the cards that got spoiled before Omens of the Past came out. Well, I couldn't help but think if I didn't review the rest of the cards, those preview videos would feel incomplete. I also have to admit that during the week of the release, Direwolf dropped a ton of spoilers on us just days before the set came out, and I fell behind. So, welcome to part 1 of my Omens of the Past card review. Before we get started, for those that didn't watch my preview videos, I will only be talking about the cards as far as viability for ranked play. If the card isn't viable for ranked play at all, then I will touch on its draft viability. I'll be going through each of the single factions first and then cover the multi-factions over the next couple of weeks. There's a lot to cover, so let's jump in. So the first card we're going to be looking at is Main Cub. This is a 1 power 1/1 requiring 1 fire influence to play. When it comes into play, you deal 1 damage to an enemy unit. So there's a lot I want to say about this card. Initially I thought this was insanely good, but I had to step back and realize it's only good against aggro. If you drop this within the first 3 turns and kill something on the opposing end, that can be a big tempo swing, even if the stats on this are underwhelming. Popping their Oni Ronin, Pyro Knight, or even a Dawnwalker is great. The drop off in power is significant for this card once you get to turn 4 and beyond though, since there will be very little this guy will actually kill. I guess if you hit Umbran Reaper, you feel pretty good, but that's about it. It can pop Aegis as well, for what it's worth, and that can be good in any stage of the game. Unfortunately, deck slots are tight in general, and this faces a lot of competition as far as 1-drop fire units go. Pyro Knight and Oni Runner are both better than this in my opinion, since they can be good at any point in the game. I don't even know if this is better than Granite and Drone, to be honest. If this could do damage to face as well, then it would have been better and may have been considered in some aggro decks. Since it can't, then I think this card will struggle to find a home in an aggro deck and will have a better chance in draft. So the next card that we're going to be looking at is Forge Wolf, and I don't have to read this card, right? I mean, I won't say much on this one since this was part of set 0, which was already in the game before they moved this card over to Omens of the Past. It's never been played and constructed seriously since it's so terrible, and the synergy it has with Spark still doesn't make it worth a deck slot. Moving on. Next card is Hidden Shiv. This is a 1 power 1/0 weapon requiring 1 fire influence to play, and it has warp. An unexciting card. The warp decks we've seen early on don't have the deck space to slot this in, and outside of warp it's strictly worse than Heavy Axe, and that never sees play in constructed. Heavy Axe barely sees play in draft. So there's no reason to really run this in draft either unless you manage to pick up a ton of warp cards, which is near impossible, I imagine. So the next card we're looking at is On the Hunt. This is a 1 power spell requiring 1 fire influence to play. And you put a 4/4 Hellhound with charge on top of your deck. So I think this card has a ton of potential. I'm honestly not sure why aggro decks aren't running this card yet. Ideally, you play this turn 1 so you get a 2 power 4/4 next turn, but even if you draw this late, it isn't that bad, since it guarantees your next draw is 4 charge damage. Any form of immediate damage is something aggro decks appreciate when they are trying to finish the game. Admittedly, I might be overhyping this for constructed though. You do have to keep in mind that your opponent will see it coming and have a turn to respond to it if you play this in the mid to late game. So the next card we're going to be looking at is Pummel. This is a 1 power fast spell requiring 1 fire influence to play. You give one of your attacking units +2/+2 this turn. You look at the top card of your deck and you may put it on the bottom. So I am not exactly sold on this one for constructed. I've seen it used in some aggro decks so far, namely Skycrag aggro. It's not terrible per se, since you get to skip your next draw if you see it's a bad one, and a +2 buff across the board is sizable. As far as Rakano and Stone Scar aggro decks go, I think this pales in comparison to Finest Hour and Rapid Shot. If there's a viable aggro deck in Praxis, it could see play there as well. Going back to Skycrag though, I think this faces competition even in that deck. Not from something with a similar effect, but just for a deck slot in general. I just feel like you could be playing something else over this, but I don't know. This is splashable in a 3-color flavor, but 3-color aggro decks aren't popular for a reason. They need to hit influence requirements on time. And 2-color decks are more consistent in doing that, no matter how many powerful cards you get access to by running 3 colors. I do hope Skycrag Plate becomes a thing though, and advocate for that deck's success, however short it may or may not be. Next on the list is Young Gun. This is a 1-power 1/1 requiring 1 fire influence to play, and it has quick draw. It's 1 strength point short of being a consideration for aggro decks, I feel. A 1/1 quick draw, it can take out other 1-drops and live, but this isn't going to do much else unless you give it equipment. Quick draw units, they're good targets for weapons, but you generally want something decent to start with, and Young Gun, it just requires too much to make it worth it, I feel. Even draft decks will probably not want to play this unless they have to. Next on the list is Blink Wolf. This is a 2-power 2/1 requiring 1 fire influence to play, and it has warp. So something I admittedly thought was very underpowered at first, along with the warp mechanic in general. However, Sir Rhino made a lot of noise with a dedicated warp deck built around Workshop Forge, and this was one of many warp cards that he ran. The result is a ton of discounted and sometimes free cards you can just cycle off the top of your deck multiple times a turn for hilarious and surprisingly effective results. But this isn't a deck tech, so I'll move on. I think if you're playing a dedicated warp deck, this card has to be considered since it can easily cost 0. As far as whether or not this will stay in that deck will depend on if Praxis Warp continues to be good. Outside of that deck though, this card sucks. Next up is Smith's Hammer. This is a 2-power 2/0 weapon requiring 1 fire influence to play, and it has Overwhelm. This once again gets compared to Heavy Axe as far as use in draft, and Heavy Axe is a fringe card already. Is the Overwhelm worth losing a point of armor and a 1-cost increase? It will depend on your deck, but I doubt this will come up often in draft since this is not a high pick. As far as constructed goes, don't bother. This is too low impact to take up a precious deck slot. So next up is Granite Ring. This is a 3-power relic requiring 1 fire influence to play. Once per turn, you may pay 3 to give your units +1 strength and overwhelm this turn. So this is the first card that's part of a cycle of rings in this set. This one I feel is middle of the road when compared to the others, although most of them feel middle of the road when compared to their siblings. The ring abilities themselves are cool effects that you have access to every turn. So this is a mini rally that trades 1 strength for Overwhelm, which might be worth it, actually, since this can get around chump blocking from the other end. Rally is probably better overall, since it's a fast spell, but not strictly. I haven't seen it played much, but I could see this replacing Rally, or at least being played along with it in some aggro lists. It's something to look out for. Next up is Grenade. This is a 3-power spell, requiring 1 fire influence to play. You sacrifice a unit to deal 3 damage to an enemy unit, and 3 damage to the enemy player. So the often less seen token sacrifice decks get another option in their arsenal, the most popular one being Stone Scar Callus. I'm not quite sure how good this card actually is. On its own, it seems okay to sack a token to kill something with 3 damage and go face for 3, especially if your opponent has a relic weapon equipped. However, token decks generally have little trouble with weapons anyway. Burnout costs 1 more, and the cost can be a huge difference, but that does 5 damage to anything, and that doesn't really see play either. Plus, Stone Scar would rather combust something, since it's hard removal for the same cost in sacrificing, and the card itself costs 1 power to cast. I can't see this one really seeing play over either of those cards in those decks. So next up is Hipshot. This is a 3 power spell requiring 1 fire influence to play. It has warp and you deal 2 damage. So I originally looked at this card in one of my preview videos for Omens of the Past, where I stated this card wouldn't see play in Constructed. However, as I said earlier, the warp decks I've seen that play this card are looking promising, so I'm a bit more positive on it since that video. However, I think warp decks are the only decks this should see play in, as it's too weak on its own without warp. My thoughts about this in draft are the same. This competes with Alchemical Blast, which also sees fringe play in draft, and at best Hipshot is a role filler there. So the next card is Jawbone Hatchet. This is a 3 power 1/1 relic weapon, requiring 2 fire influence to play. It has Spark, and you gain +2 attack and +2 armor. So I don't think this is playable in Constructed, because it's too low impact for the cost overall. I will get that out of the way. The only case where this is remotely good is maybe in a low curve aggro deck, specifically built to take advantage of Spark in the first few turns, and you end up with a Sword of Ikaria with 1 more armor and no Warcry. I just don't think it's worth it. Draft, however, might be a different story. Even if you don't get the Spark off, if you have this early enough, there will probably be some dork on your opponent's side that you can kill with or without combat damage help from your units. I don't think it's a high pick, but I think it's a consideration, depending on what your deck needs. So next on the list is going to be Sparkbot. This is a 3 power 1/4 unit requiring 1 fire influence to play. It has Spark, and you play a 1/1 Grenade when Spark activates. Another role filler for draft. Since in Constructed, every single deck running fire has better options than this for their turn 3. I could see this being mildly annoying for aggressive draft decks though, unless they have a combat trick to get around it. I've picked it before in draft when I needed a 3-drop, and it wasn't amazing, but it was alright. Next up is Stone Scar Excavator. This is a 3 power relic requiring 1 fire influence to play. Once per turn, you may pay 4 and discard a power card to deal 1 damage to the enemy player for each power card in your void. So originally I was confused about this card and thought that the power you played counted as entering the void, but that makes no sense because power cards played go into their own zone. The very text on the card gives away the fact that this is both an effect that you build up towards over multiple turns, and is also flood prevention when you're top decking. I do hear there's a 50 power deck going around that's running this card, but it doesn't seem like there's any other real support for this card in the new set though. So in general, I think people are likely going to skip over this until something else comes along that clearly has synergy with this. It's a cool card, but it doesn't really fit in any of the more obvious Constructed decks. Next up is Stone Shaker. This is a 3 power 1/1 unit requiring 1 fire influence to play. When it comes into play, you reduce the cost of each unit in your deck by 1. So this card is one of the 2 cards that makes the warp decks tick in my opinion, the other being Workshop Forge. You don't play this for the 1/1. You play it for the summon effect, and the discounts you can get off your warp cards can add up very quickly, to the point where they end up being free a lot of the time. But anyway, this thing has been making noise, and it's probably a core card in a dedicated warp deck, and it's also likely terrible outside of that particular deck. So next up is Twin Barrel. This is a 3-power 0/0 weapon requiring 1 fire influence to play, and it has double damage. So the idea is to put this on a unit that already has a high strength stat. Honestly, I feel like that unit has to also have Overwhelm in its text, since Overwhelm and double damage go well together on a unit with aggressive stats. You're not going to get that often enough in draft, and I think deck slots in Constructed are far too precious to use them on this card. I'd skip over this one. Next up is Audacious Bandit. This is a 4-power 4/2 unit requiring 1 fire influence to play. When its spark is activated, it gains quick draw. So this can be pretty annoying in draft, since removal is like gold in that format. I've lost to this card in draft more than once so far. As far as Constructed, this pales in comparison to basically every 4-drop your deck running fire could be using instead. Even Mono Fire has Groundbreaker, who we'll be talking about in a bit. Next up is Granite Ring Cannoneer. This is a 4-power 5/1 unit requiring 1 fire influence to play. When its spark is activated, you put a firebomb in the enemy player's deck. So I am very glad that we have another card that puts firebombs into opponents' decks besides Light Diffuse. You can at least run 8 copies of that effect in a deck, and you should to get any form of consistency out of it. There still isn't really any mill support yet, although the 1-drop shadow unit in the set Fallen Oni counts, I guess. But outside of Light Diffuse decks, this should never see play in Constructed though, and I think only draft players take this if they are desperate for 4-drops, which sounds weird in itself, honestly, since this is Fire we're talking about, the most aggressive faction in the game. So next up is Groundbreaker. This is a 4-power 3/6 unit requiring 3 fire influence to play. The enemy player cannot gain health. When its spark is activated, it gains double damage. So I went over this card in a previous video when this got spoiled, so feel free to check that one out. I won't say much because of it, since my feelings are still the same. Every aggro deck running fire should be trying this out, including Stone Scar. The jury is still out on this fitting in Skycrag burn heavy spell decks though, and maybe just Skycrag in general. Next on the list is Library Phoenix. This is a 4-power 2/2 unit requiring 2 fire influence to play. At the start of your turn, reduce the cost of non-unit cards in your hand by 1. And this gains +3 strength and flying while you have no cards in hand. So this card has an interesting problem. The deck you would want to play this in would want to be light on units to take advantage of the first effect. The problem is, when you do that, this card becomes a target for your opponent's removal when it would normally be offline. This is why I wish this took place at the end of your turn, so you have a much better chance of getting value off of it. But it would probably be too good if that was the case. Granted, I could see this in a warp deck, and I think that's the only deck this would see play in for now. The second effect is just weird, but it probably cements the idea of playing this in a warp deck even more. A 5/2 flyer isn't awful in a deck that plans to curve out early, though it's really weak to all sorts of removal. Once buffed, this only dodges Suffocate, just to give an idea. So next up is Outlands Brute. This is a 4-power 4/1 unit requiring 2 fire influence to play. It has charge and warp. When an enemy spell is played directly on Outlands Brute, he deals 2 damage to the enemy player. So I went over this card in one of my preview videos, but this was revealed before Groundbreaker was, and now that the whole set is out, the view I had on this has changed from fringe card that needs help to only playable in dedicated warp decks, otherwise don't bother with it in constructed. A Groundbreaker is better in nearly every possible way, and the few corner cases where Outlands Brute is better are so rare that it's not worth running this over Groundbreaker. Next up is Reforge. This is a 4-power spell requiring 1 fire influence to play. You draw a weapon from your void, and it gets plus 2 strength and plus 2 armor. So I can only see this being played in relic weapon decks that don't have access to Smuggler Stash, which is superior in every way. Regardless, Armory players have been testing this card, so we'll see if it sticks. I don't think something like Ikaria Blue or Ikaria Gold want this either. They just have so much else to do at every stage of the game to have time to play this. The buff is nice for them though, since they have a harder time pumping their relic weapons than traditional Armory, so maybe. As far as other decks running equipment like Rakano Plate, I'm not sure they would play this either as a late game option. I just think deck slots are too tight for this to see play in constructed. So next up is Swift Stranger. This is a 4-power 3/3 unit requiring 1 fire influence to play, and strangers have charge. He's back! This used to be in closed beta before it got removed when Eternal went into open beta. In fact, you'll start to notice that a bunch of the support that strangers got in this new set are via old cards that were previously removed from the game. This is the first of several. I will hold judgment as far as this being constructed worthy, as that will depend on finding a good strangers build where this still might not see play. If you can get a couple strangers in draft, this isn't bad to have. Next up is Thunderhoof Warrior. This is a 4-power 3/3 unit requiring 1 fire influence to play. It has Overwhelm. Also has an ultimate where you pay 6 to give Thunderhoof Warrior +2/+2. So this is the first of a cycle of power sync units in this set. It's a decent draft pick. I haven't been sad yet every time I see this in my hand in draft and I can play it. Much better options at this 4-drop slot for constructed though. Next up is Dustblind. This is a 5-power spell that requires 1 fire influence to play. It has warp and you exhaust 2 enemy units. We have Cloud of Ash in constructed, which exhausts all units for less. And that doesn't see play. Moving on. Next up is Gundown. This is a 5-power spell requiring 1 fire influence to play. You deal 5 damage to a unit without quick draw. As far as constructed, we have Obliterate, which is unconditional 6 damage with Overwhelm. There's no reason to run this in constructed. This is draft chaff, and only if you're desperate for removal. Next on the list is Pit Fighter. This is a 5-power 6/3 unit requiring 1 fire influence to play. He's also back. Another card removed from the game when Eternal went into open beta. Still unplayable and constructed though. All popular spot removal gets him except for Suffocate, and you can find much better things to do than play this on turn 5. Next up is Pouncing Drake. This is a 5-power 4/4 unit requiring 2 fire influence to play. It has flying and warp. So this one probably won't see play in constructed other than a dedicated warp deck, and even those decks have other things they'd rather be doing on turn 5, like playing Workshop Forge. Once Forge is on the table though, I think this isn't half bad, but again, deck slots are tight. This is just a decent card in its own right though, and it's a solid draft pick in my opinion. Next up is Stone Powder Heretic. This is a 5 power 2/4 unit requiring 1 fire influence to play. When Stone Powder Heretic attacks, double his strength this turn. So the idea behind this is to put a weapon or two on this thing, hence why it has fairly defensive stats. The problem is that a lot of your cards have to at least be good on their own without help from another card when it comes to the constructed. Only combo decks really have the ability to get away with running cards that are bad on their own, if that same card wins them the game when combined with something else. This card doesn't do that, and it takes too much work to keep it going. I haven't even really been happy seeing this in draft either, but it might be okay if you have a lot of weapons already. Next on the list is Bad News. This is a 6 power spell requiring 2 fire influence to play. It has warp, and you ready your units and they can attack again. Oh boy. We're getting serious. I love how Direwolf is playing with text flavor in this set. This card is bad news, in my opinion. It has so much potential to be dangerous in a combo deck or in a warp deck. The thing is, though, you don't need to play it in those decks specifically. I think this is one of the few warp cards that's actually still good outside of a warp deck. I feel like every unit-heavy aggro deck that curves up to 5 currently should try to work a copy of this in their deck. Even though aggro decks can't really afford to play something that costs 6 in general, I feel like the effect can just be that powerful when you have the right board, which is often in those decks. It's just another way to get lethal and end the game immediately, but maybe I'm overhyping this card. Who knows? I'll be sad if this doesn't see constructed play, but I won't be that surprised if it happens. So the next card on the list is Cannoneer. This is a 6 power 5/6 unit requiring 2 fire influence to play. It has warp. When she comes into play, she deals 1 damage to an enemy. So in constructed, and this is my opinion, if you're paying 6 or more for something, it better have a huge impact on the game, preferably immediately. This isn't strong enough to see play in constructed. Now, I have seen this in dedicated warp decks, but this might get cut as people continue to refine the archetype. If it does, I wouldn't be surprised. As far as draft though, this isn't too bad as a curve topper, though there are better ones. The effect is still not that impactful by the time you get to turn 6, but warp has some merit on its own. So next up on the list is Flame Stoker. This is a 6 power relic requiring 3 fire influence to play. At the start of your turn, play an Infernus. So I really like this card. Just the concept of popping out Infernus cards every turn to try and end the game quickly is hilarious to me. Or maybe it's the art that's getting my imagination going. Probably the art. Spending turn 6 to do nothing is bad, but if you're getting a 5/5 overwhelm charge every turn after that for free, it doesn't take that long to get a payoff. I want to see this card in constructed, though I think I'm in the minority. And it'll be tough since aggro decks don't want to go to 6 power in general. Maybe a bigger burn deck would want this though. Something similar to Stone Scar Maulers, or even just a bigger mono fire list in general is what I'm thinking. Next up is Burning Glaive. This is a 7 power 5/3 weapon requiring 1 fire influence to play. So I'm glad this isn't the last card because it's pretty bad in my opinion. No one in their right mind playing constructed would put this in their deck. It costs too much for too little of an effect. And unfortunately, this is too slow for the effect in draft as well. Hellfire Rifle is better than this, and that typically doesn't find its way into draft decks. And finally, we have Sindok Rage Incarnate. This is a 9 power 7/4 unit requiring 2 fire influence to play. Sindok has flying, and Sindok costs 1 less for each damage the enemy player has taken this turn. So this is a fun card. It's not fun when you lose to it out of nowhere because your opponent cheated it out, but I like the card nonetheless. It's probably too gimmicky to see play in Constructed though, and a 7/4 stat line that will probably not come out until at least the mid game isn't that tough to get rid of. Every popular removal card kills this but Torch and Suffocate. I still think the card is cool though. And we're done with the fire cards. For those that stuck around to the end, thanks so much for listening to my thoughts on this set of cards. Hopefully you enjoyed the content. If you want to check out more, feel free to look around my channel. I have a few Eternal series that I do, such as Eternal Heirs, which I plan to be starting back up soon. But it's a pretty good resource if you want to avoid misplays I made with certain decks. There's no deck text here yet, but sometimes I do videos discussing what I've learned playing certain decks. But there's plenty of other Eternal content as well. And if you don't want to miss future videos, feel free to subscribe to the channel. Anyway, thanks again for taking time out of your day to watch this, and I'll see you all soon. Take care.